Najaf, April 4th, 2004. 5 days after Fallujah. 5 days after the bridge. 5 days after the bodies, the flames, the images, and the shock. And while much of the world was still staring at what had happened in Fallujah, another battle was already beginning. This time in the south. This time in one of the holiest cities in Iraq. And this time, the men at the center of it were not conventional soldiers. Years later, people would describe Najaf in very different ways. To some, it was a desperate stand. A small group of Americans and Allied personnel, isolated inside a hostile city, holding their ground while armed men closed in around them. To others, it was something much more unsettling, a warning, a glimpse of what the Iraq War had already become. Blurred, privatized, improvised, and far harder to control than many Americans had been told. Because this was not a normal battle, not a conventional front line, not a clean military operation unfolding under a simple chain of command. This was urban war, political war, religious war, psychological war, and on one rooftop in Najaf. All of those things collided at once. To understand why Najaf mattered, you have to understand where Iraq stood in the spring of 2004. The invasion phase was over. Saddam Hussein was gone. The statues had already fallen. The easy victory language had already been used. But what came after was slower, darker, and much harder to define. Because toppling a regime was one thing. Controlling what replaced it was something else entirely. Across Iraq, power did not disappear. It fragmented. Old loyalties survived. New armed groups emerged. Religious authority returned to the center of politics. And in more and more places, the occupation was no longer being watched with uncertainty. It was being watched with anger. By then, the United States was learning one of the oldest lessons in war. Winning the invasion does not mean winning the country. A government can collapse quickly. A military can collapse quickly. But the vacuum left behind can be more dangerous than what came before, especially when humiliation, religion, foreign occupation, and armed politics all begin to mix at the same time. One of the men rising inside that vacuum was Muqtada al-Sadr. Young, combative, often underestimated, but increasingly impossible to ignore. He carried a famous family name. He spoke the language of defiance, and to many poor Shiites, he sounded like one of the few men willing to openly challenge the occupation. His appeal was not built on one thing alone. It came from religion, from poverty, from resentment, from humiliation, from the belief that Iraq was no longer ruled by Saddam, but still not truly in Iraqi hands. That combination was powerful, and by April 2004, it was becoming explosive. His armed movement became known as the Mahdi Army. Not a polished army in the Western sense, not a neatly disciplined force, but an armed network, local, emotional, religious, political, and increasingly willing to test American authority wherever it could. Then, the pressure increased. Coalition authorities shut down Sadr's newspaper. They moved harder against his network. And then came the arrest of one of his top deputies, Mustafa al-Yaqubi. That mattered. Because moments like this are never only administrative. One arrest becomes a signal becomes an insult, and an insult in the right atmosphere becomes ignition. For Sadr, it was the kind of move that demanded response. For many of his followers, it confirmed what they already believed. The occupation was not simply in Iraq. It intended to dominate Iraq. And once that belief hardens, events can move very quickly. Thousands of supporters began moving toward Kufa and Najaf. Roads filled, crowds grew, weapons appeared, administrative buildings were taken over. Police authority started bending, then disappearing. And the uprising no longer looked like a warning. It looked like momentum. That is what makes Najaf so important. Because Najaf was no ordinary city. This was one of the holiest places in Shiite Islam. A city of shrines, a city of religious memory, a city of symbolism, which meant that confrontation there was never just tactical, it was political, psychological, religious. Every move in Najaf carried a meaning larger than itself. In war, symbolism matters, sometimes more than firepower. A city can become more than a location. It can become a message. And Najaf in the spring of 2004 was exactly that kind of place. Who controlled it mattered. Who fought there mattered. Who bled there mattered. And who appeared weak there mattered most of all. At the center of that city sat the Coalition Provisional Authority headquarters, a local symbol of occupation rule, a physical reminder that foreign power still sat inside one of Iraq's most sacred spaces, which meant that once the uprising gained momentum, that compound was always going to matter, and guarding that compound was Blackwater. That detail matters because by 2004, private contractors were already deeply embedded in the Iraq War. The military carried the main burden, but the war also depended on security details, convoy teams, compound protection, transport escorts, and armed specialists operating beside the official structure. Blackwater had become one of the most visible of those forces. To supporters, that made the company effective, fast, professional, aggressive when needed. To critics, it made the company dangerous, a sign that the United States was outsourcing force in ways that blurred the line between public war and private war. Najaf would bring that argument into full view. On the morning of April 4th, as the sun came up over Najaf, a small number of Blackwater men were on the roof of the CPA headquarters they were assigned to protect. The American military presence inside the city was limited. Negotiations with Shiite leaders had already constrained U.S. visibility there, so the compound was more exposed than many people would probably imagine. According to the accounts from that day, Blackwater had just 8 men guarding the facility. With them were troops from El Salvador, and by chance, a few U.S. Marines were also there. Not because this was supposed to become a major battle, but because Iraq in 2004 had a way of turning routine presence into sudden survival. One of those Marines was Corporal Lonnie Young. He had not come to Najaf looking for a famous fight. He was there to install communications equipment. A technical job, a practical job, the kind of assignment that sounds minor in hindsight, which is exactly what makes stories like this feel so real. The day was not planned as legend, it became legend against its own intentions. Young later described seeing protesters outside the gate, then coalition personnel in riot gear, then heading back toward his truck, and then hearing the unmistakable sound of AK-47 fire. At that point, the day changed. He grabbed his weapon, moved toward the building, and went up to the roof. That rooftop is where the story truly begins. Because from that moment on, this was no longer a tense demonstration, no longer a crowd problem, no longer a security inconvenience. It was a live defensive fight, and everyone on that roof knew it. Urban combat compresses everything: time, distance, judgment. A rooftop gives you height, it gives you vision, but it does not give you certainty. You can see movement, approach routes, shapes, flashes, weapons, bodies in motion, but you still cannot see everything. And in battle, what you cannot see can kill you. The defenders took positions. Weapons came up, angles were covered, fields of fire were established, and the roof became what rooftops in urban war so often become. A temporary island, a final barrier, a place from which men try to buy time, while the city below grows more dangerous by the minute. Supportive accounts frame what happened next as a classic hold-the-line moment, a small group, outnumbered, exposed, under real threat of being overrun. That version emphasizes discipline, calm, and professionalism under pressure. The idea that these were exactly the kind of men you would want there when everything started collapsing, and that reading is not difficult to understand, because the threat was real. The compound was under pressure. The men on the roof were not imagining danger. They were inside danger. The crowd was not simply angry, it was moving. Armed men were present, and the city around them was no longer stable. That is one of the key truths of Najaf. The battle did not begin as some carefully staged American assault. It began as a defensive crisis. The compound was vulnerable. The symbol of occupation power was in danger, and the men on the roof were trying to hold a position that suddenly mattered far more than it had an hour earlier. This is where the battle becomes intensely cinematic, without needing any exaggeration. A holy city, a rooftop, a rising militia, a swelling crowd, a handful of contractors, allied troops, and Marines trying to read the streets below before the next burst of fire, the next movement, the next approach. The tension is already there. You do not have to invent it, but the story does not stay clean. It cannot. Because Najaf was not a battlefield stripped of civilian meaning. It was a live city, religiously charged, politically charged, emotionally charged, and every shot fired from that rooftop existed inside that larger reality. This is where the strongest version of the story lives. Not in simple praise, not in simple condemnation, but in tension. Because yes, there was a real threat. Yes, there was a real fight. Yes, the defenders may very well have prevented the compound from falling. And yes, the event also reveals how morally and politically combustible the war had already become. As the firefight continued, the problem became more than courage. It became arithmetic, ammunition, time, distance, support. Those are the things that start to dominate the mind once a defensive fight lasts longer than expected. And according to the accounts from that day, urgent calls went out asking for more ammunition, reinforcements, possible extraction, and help. That tells you everything you need to know about how serious the situation had become, because people watching war from far away often imagine battle as a test of bravery, and of course, it is that. But inside a real defensive fight, it is also a test of logistics. How much ammunition remains, how fast support can arrive, how long a position can hold before confidence turns into calculation, and calculation turns into fear. At some point, according to Prince's account, the defenders were running frighteningly low on ammunition. That changes the emotional structure of a battle, because now every burst matters, every reload matters, every decision to fire or hold fire becomes heavier. And men start doing the same quiet math in their heads. How much do we have left? How much longer can this last? What happens if help does not come? That is one reason Najaf works so well as a long-form war story. Because beneath the politics, the human tension is very real. A group of armed men on a roof, a city turning below them, and the growing realization that if they lose this position, they may lose much more than a building. The attackers, broadly identified as Mahdi Army fighters and armed supporters, used exactly what urban insurgents always try to use: density, approach routes, confusion, cover, momentum. They did not need to look like a conventional army to become dangerous. They only needed enough men, enough movement, and enough local advantage to make the defenders feel pressure from multiple directions. And momentum matters, because once a crowd, a militia, and a city's emotional energy begin feeding each other, events can escalate beyond anyone's clean plan. A protest becomes a siege becomes a battle becomes a symbol, and a symbol can outlive all the details that created it. This is also where the more critical reading of Najaf becomes essential. Because the problem is not whether there was danger. There was. The problem is how that danger was experienced, described, and remembered. Skahill's version turns attention toward tone, toward mentality, toward the language some of the men later used about the fighting, and that is where the story becomes morally uncomfortable. In that reading, what troubles the viewer is not the existence of combat. It is the possibility that the fight took on a psychological character that feels darker from the outside, that a rooftop, once it became a dominant firing position, also became a place where fear, adrenaline, and killing blended into something deeply unsettling to anyone not inside that moment. That tension should stay in the story, because the weakest way to tell Najaf would be to flatten it, to make it only a heroic last stand, or only a story of reckless contractors. That would be lazy. The real power of Najaf is that both readings contain something true, and they sharpen each other. Supporters emphasize that the men on the roof were under genuine threat, that they were trying to protect the compound, that if they had failed, the consequences could have been catastrophic for the Americans inside. That argument is serious. It cannot just be waved away, because in a place like Najaf on a day like that, defensive collapse could have become massacre very quickly. Critics emphasize something else, that private, armed men fighting from rooftops in one of Shiite Islam's holiest cities during a politically explosive uprising is not something that should ever be casually romanticized. Even if the firefight was real, even if the danger was real, the broader image remains unsettling. And that discomfort is part of the truth too. That is why Najaf works especially well after Fallujah. Fallujah was horror. Fallujah was humiliation. Fallujah was spectacle. Fallujah was the image that forced Americans to confront contractor vulnerability. Najaf is different. Najaf is combat, direct combat, immediate combat, combat that many viewers will instinctively read as more clearly battle. That difference matters, because here the central question is not whether there was a fight. There was. The deeper question is what that fight reveals. About the occupation, about state power, about how far the United States had already gone in relying on armed private force to keep its presence functioning. And that is where Najaf becomes bigger than Blackwater itself. Because even if someone has no opinion on the company, the battle still forces a larger question. What kind of war puts private contractors in a position like this? What kind of military-political system makes them essential? And what happens when those contractors perform well under fire? Does that justify the system or expose it? At some point, outside support began to matter. Aircraft, helicopter movement, the sound from above that changes the emotional temperature of a battlefield almost instantly. For the defenders, it means they are not alone. For the attackers, it means the clock may no longer belong to them. In urban fighting, that shift can be decisive. According to Prince's account, ammunition and support were moved in with little birds. That matters not because it turns the story into some clean rescue narrative, it does not, but because it shows how close the defenders believed they were to being unable to sustain the fight without outside help. And when a rooftop defense reaches that point, the battle is no longer just intense, it is fragile. Eventually, additional U.S. forces moved into the area. The crowd was dispersed. The immediate crisis eased, but the meaning of the battle only began growing after that. Because once the shooting stops, a second battle always begins. The battle over memory, over interpretation, over what the event was supposed to mean. To some observers, Najaf proved that Blackwater's defenders had a point. When the situation turned truly dangerous, these men did not run. They held, they fought, and they helped prevent a major occupation outpost from being overrun. That reading is simple, powerful, and emotionally persuasive, which is exactly why it spread. But there was another reading, too. That Najaf was an early warning, a warning about the culture of private war, a warning about how blurred the line between security and combat had already become, a warning that America was normalizing a contractor-heavy war structure without fully confronting its moral and political consequences. And maybe the strongest way to tell the story is to let both of those things remain visible, because courage does not erase discomfort, and discomfort does not erase real danger. Those truths can live side by side. In fact, in Najaf, they probably have to. There is also a broader historical reason. The battle still matters. By the spring of 2004, Iraq was revealing what it really was. Not a simple post-war stabilization effort, not a clean transition to order, but a fragmented conflict where religion, nationalism, militia politics, occupation policy, and private force were all colliding at once. Najaf condensed all of that into one event. That is what gives battles historical weight. Not just size, not just body count, concentration, the ability to reveal larger truths all at once. A sacred city, a rising militia, an exposed occupation headquarters, private contractors under siege, air support overhead, and the growing realization that the war was entering a much more dangerous phase than many Americans had expected. For older American viewers especially, that carries a familiar undertone. The undertone of a war becoming more complicated than it was sold. A war that begins in clear language and then settles into ambiguity, contradiction, and improvisation. A war where tactical success can exist inside strategic uncertainty. A war where brave men can do difficult things inside a system that still raises disturbing questions. Najaf sits exactly in that space. It is not just a fight, not just a contractor story, not just a militia uprising. It is a diagnostic moment, a moment when the Iraq War briefly showed its full architecture, sacred geography, political rage, private force, state weakness, and the thin line between security work and combat. There is also a human truth that should not get lost. The men on that roof were not abstractions, not slogans, not just symbols in a larger argument. They were individuals dealing with live fire, imperfect information, pressure, fear, and the immediate need to survive. Whatever larger conclusions someone draws about Blackwater, that immediate reality remains. And yet the story is bigger than the men themselves, because once the shooting stopped, Najaf did not become just a tale of a rooftop defense. It became a mirror. To supporters, it reflected resolve. To critics, it reflected the unsettling structure of privatized war. To historians, it reflects both, and that is why it endures. For Sadr's followers and many Iraqis, the day would be remembered very differently. Not as a narrow defensive success, but as part of a bloody confrontation inside one of Shiite Islam's holiest cities. That memory matters too, because battles in places like Najaf never remain just tactical events. They enter myth, they enter grievance, they enter politics, and once they do, their afterlife becomes as important as the firefight itself. That is why Najaf should not be told like cheap action content. The action is real, the tension is real, the rooftop defense is real, but the event becomes stronger, not weaker, when it is framed inside the larger collapse around it. The collapse of local order, the rise of militia power, and the growing realization that the occupation was entering a much harsher chapter. In one city, Fallujah had shown the horror of contractor vulnerability. In another, Najaf showed the depth of contractor integration. Fallujah showed Americans dying inside the system. Najaf showed how central those same contractors had become to keeping that system alive. Taken together, the two stories say something powerful about Iraq in 2004. The war was no longer behaving according to old categories. That may be the deepest reason Najaf still matters, because it forces the viewer to remain inside contradiction. Yes, the defenders faced real danger. Yes, they may have prevented the compound from falling. Yes, the event also reveals how strange and politically combustible America's contractor-heavy war structure had become. Those truths do not weaken the story. They are the story. Najaf, April 4th, 2004. A rooftop defense to some, a warning sign to others. But either way, one of those moments when the Iraq War stopped looking simple and revealed what it had already become. Fragmented, violent, improvised, and impossible to understand honestly, without looking straight at all of it. Not just the bullets, not just the bravery, not just the controversy, but the whole structure around it. The city, the uprising, the occupation, the contractors, the politics, the symbolism, the fear, the need to hold. And the kind of war that creates a moment like that in the first place. Because Najaf was never only about one rooftop. It was about the war around that rooftop. And on that day, for a few violent hours, that war showed its true face. A face that was not clean, not stable, not easy to narrate. And maybe that is exactly why the story still holds. Because even now it refuses to stay simple. It was not merely heroism, not merely excess, not merely security work gone wrong, not merely militia violence. It was all of those things pressing against each other at the same time, in one city, on one day. That is the uncomfortable truth at the center of Najaf, and really at the center of Iraq itself. The most historically important events are rarely clean, rarely linear, rarely easy to explain. They are layered, contradictory, human, and violent in ways that policy language can never fully capture. Najaf was one of those events. A battle, yes. A survival story, yes. But also something larger, a warning, a preview, a glimpse of the Iraq War's real complexity arriving in full view, through dust, gunfire, fear, religion, politics, and the strange machinery of a war that had already stopped obeying its own official script. Because once war becomes fragmented, everything is connected. The arrest, the crowd, the holy city, the compound, the contractors, the Marines, the ammunition, the helicopters, the symbolism, the memory. None of it stands alone. And that may be the real lesson of Najaf. Not simply that men fought on a rooftop, but that, by April of 2004, the Iraq War had become a system so unstable that one uprising in one sacred city could expose far more than the battle itself. That is what gives Najaf its place in the history of the war. Not only the firefight, not only the siege, not only the argument over Blackwater, but the revelation. The revelation that the occupation was more fragile than it looked. The revelation that private armed men had become central to its survival. And the revelation that Iraq was moving into a phase where every confrontation carried the potential to become something much bigger than anyone intended. Battles are not always remembered for how they start. Sometimes they are remembered for what they reveal. And Najaf revealed a great deal. It revealed the pressure building inside Shiite Iraq. It revealed the emotional reach of al-Sadr's movement. It revealed the vulnerability of occupation symbols. And it revealed the strange architecture holding America's position together. That architecture was not made of soldiers alone. It was made of contractors, security teams, allied contingents, ad hoc presence, improvised support, and a political strategy that often relied on layers of force the American public barely understood. Najaf made that visible, not through paperwork, through battle, and that visibility matters, because once you can see a war clearly, it becomes harder to explain it in simple phrases. The old categories stop working. Soldier, civilian, security, support, rear area, front line, all of it starts to blur. And blurred categories are where some of the most consequential war stories always live. Najaf lives there, in that blur, where courage does not erase discomfort, where discomfort does not erase real danger, where a defensive stand can be genuine and still reveal something deeply unsettling about the system behind it. That is the exact tension that gives the story its weight. This is also why the battle should not be oversold. It does not need exaggeration. The facts are already strong enough. A holy city in revolt, a CPA headquarters under siege, 8 Blackwater men, Salvadoran troops, a few Marines, urgent requests for ammunition and help, little birds bringing support, senior commanders arriving afterward. That is already more than enough. And once you strip away the cheap framing, what remains is stronger anyway. A city becoming hostile by the hour, a compound that cannot simply disappear, a rooftop that suddenly matters, and men realizing that if they lose that position, they may lose much more than a building. They may lose the symbolic center of American authority in Najaf itself. In the end, Najaf is not memorable because it offers easy answers. It is memorable because it does not. Was it a legitimate defensive fight? Yes. Did it also reveal how strange and politically combustible America's contractor-heavy war structure had become? Also, yes, those truths do not cancel each other out, they sharpen each other. That is the point where the story becomes larger than Blackwater. Because even people with no real interest in the company can look at Najaf and see something important. A war no longer behaving as its architects expected. A conflict in which sacred geography, militia politics, public symbolism, and outsourced force were colliding in real time. A war growing more unstable, not less. And maybe that is the final reason this battle still matters. It shows Iraq in miniature, a country where nothing stayed in its assigned box. Religion became battlefield, security became combat, contractors became central actors, and a local uprising in one holy city became a window into the much larger crisis of the occupation itself. Najaf, April 4th, 2004. A rooftop defense to some, a warning sign to others, but either way. One of those moments when the Iraq War stopped pretending to be orderly and showed what it really was. Complicated, fragmented, violent, improvised, and impossible to understand honestly, without looking straight at all of it. Because Najaf was never only about one rooftop. It was about the war around that rooftop. And on that day, for a few violent hours, that war showed its true face.